Memphis, Tennessee. December 1851. Rain fell cold and steady along the riverfront, thick as a funeral veil, when the day's commerce condensed into a single transaction that would not be forgotten. On an auction block soaked with mud and the wet breath of the Mississippi, a young man changed the course of several fortunes with a single sale. Not for his strength, not for his age, but for an appearance and bearing that defied the trade's ordinary calculus. The price was obscene. It was a sum that made men hush and look at one another in counting rooms and parlors, a price that set into motion a slow, inexorable rot in the city's most powerful families. Within 6 months, 3 of Memphis's great houses would be unmade. Within a year, the man who'd arranged the sale would simply disappear, leaving only cryptic journal entries and the sense he had touched upon something far stranger than commerce. Newspapers from those weeks contain gaps, entire stretches of print, gone as if someone had excised them with a deliberate hand. And where silence falls in the archive, rumor always gathers like carrion birds. What was it about that young man that made otherwise cautious men gamble their fortunes and reputations? What secret did his transfer conceal that the powerful would prefer buried? Before we continue into what local whispers would come to call the Memphis Enigma, pause and listen. Subscribe, hit the bell. Stories like this survive on attention, and what follows will ask you to rethink the certainties of the antebellum South. The truth of the matter did not begin on the auction block, but some months earlier, in the restless spring of 1851. Memphis then was a city on the rise. Cotton warehouses like two-handed giants along Front Street. River traffic a steady artery, profit the city's pulse. It had eclipsed Louisville in exports, and in doing so, became the Western marketplace for a trade that treated people as ledger entries. Elegant columns faced the river. Auction halls echoed with the economy's mechanical liturgy, and in the salons of the wealthy, status was measured in possessions both ostentatious and private. 3 families held the city's commercial gravity: the Harringtons, the Daltons, and the Kendishes. Edmund Harrington, Virginia-bred and merciless in his dealings, controlled the largest cotton holdings along the river. His son Charles, 32, handsome and carefully cruel, had learned to move among people as a man might move among chessmen, always 3 steps ahead. Jacob Dalton's rise had been feral. He had come with nothing, and with a keen mind for numbers, became Memphis's preeminent slave broker, a man who could supply any labor a planter might require, and whose discretion made him indispensable. Richard Cavendish, Charleston money and New Orleans shipping ties, arrived with a wife, Victoria, who turned salons into courts where alliances were forged behind closed doors. They existed in the soft theater of civility, polite smiles, measured invitations, while beneath the tableau rivalries seethed. Each sought the acquisition that would anchor dominance. Each watched the other with the thin, bright eyes of predators. It was into that atmosphere that Ambrose Fletcher arrived in November. Fletcher was the kind of trader whispered about in clubrooms, solitary, taciturn, the kind of man who trafficked not only in bodies, but in peculiarities. He took a room on Madison Avenue, avoided the grand hotels and the public auction block, and did business in a silence that became rumor. Where the market favored spectacle, Fletcher offered discretion, and in a place built on public bidding and social proof, his secrecy itself felt like a promise of something exceptional. The talk began in low, conspiratorial tones, a slave of extraordinary appearance, a beauty that arrested men on the street. Eyes that did not simply look but measured, features like carved marble, a bearing that suggested privilege rather than subjugation. It was the kind of description that gathered mythic details the longer it was repeated. And when William Drexler, a tobacco merchant, described glancing past Fletcher and stalling mid-step at the sight of the man, the rumor landed where gossip always lands, in the ears of those who coveted distinction. Charles Harrington heard it over a card game at the Memphis club. Drexler's voice dropped to an almost culpable whisper as he recalled the moment. "I've been in this business 20 years, he said. "I've seen thousands. Nothing prepared me for that afternoon. It wasn't merely the face, it was how he moved. Like he carried knowledge the rest of us lacked." Charles, who had learned to convert beauty into currency, felt the story like an ember against dry tinder. Edmund had been grousing about the house staff, no one with the polish suitable to their station. A remarkably trained house slave could be a phenomenon at dinner parties, a living emblem of the family's reach. The price Fletcher attached, $3,000, was obscene. A prime field hand rarely fetched $1,500. An educated house slave might command $2,000. $3,000 suggested madness or something genuinely exceptional. He made inquiries. Fletcher was preparing to leave. The trader's disposition was non-negotiable. He demanded the sum outright, gold or bank draft, no promises and no partials. Charles arranged a private viewing in a cramped boarding room that smelled of lamp oil and river damp. Fletcher welcomed him with the look of a man who had traversed hard roads and kept his distance from sentiment. The young man Fletcher brought forward stood perhaps 6 feet tall and moved with a measured grace that made the cramped room feel like a stage. His skin had the warm, sun-amber hue of mixed blood. His features bore a symmetry that seemed almost mathematical. Cheekbones carved, jaw steady, eyes a shifting gray-green that took on a different light under the oil lamp. He wore simple, clean clothes. There were no chains. The posture of submission was performed rather than surrendered, hands clasped, gaze downcast. And in that performance, Charles felt something electric, like a pulse beneath skin. "His name is Marcus," Fletcher said. 23, born in Virginia. Educated, that's not an exaggeration. Reads and writes in English and French. Trained in household management, bookkeeping, music. Never been a field hand. Health excellent. Price non-negotiable. Charles examined the young man as one might examine a sculpture, circling, measuring. Marcus raised his hands. The skin at the fingers was soft, uncalloused. "Look at me," Charles ordered. The gaze Marcus offered was steady and, just for an instant, oddly assessing. Charles felt seen rather than seeing. It was unnerving. "Why hadn't someone already bought him?" Charles asked. Fletcher's expression darkened. "Men here," he said, "lack imagination. They see beauty and assume damage. They think him a pleasure slave, or worse, assume he's been broken. That prejudice kept buyers away. You have the advantage." Fletcher produced papers, a bill of sale from a Virginia estate, transfer documents, a letter signed by a Mrs. Eleanor Stratton of Richmond, attesting to Marcus's character. Charles demanded the paperwork he could present to his attorney. Fletcher would accept nothing less than the bank draft the next day, at 2 o'clock, in Charles's lawyer's office. Marcus's presence throughout the meeting was an economy of silence. He reacted in ways that suggested he had long since learned the art of restraint. Charles agreed. He felt the thrill of a consummated acquisition, the anticipated envy, the social instrument Marcus might become. He could not have known, walking back through Memphis's darkened streets, that he had bought more than a house servant. What he had purchased was a fulcrum, and within his grasp, The city's polite facades would soon begin to fracture. The sale took place precisely as Fletcher promised. Horace Pembroke, the Harrington family's attorney, signed off after reading the documents and the bill of sale. The draft was produced from the Memphis Trust Bank. Signatures changed hands. Marcus accepted the transfer as if it were the inevitable crediting of accounts. Fletcher left Memphis that afternoon for New Orleans and was never seen again in those parts. Attempts to trace him in the following months led only to dead ends. That evening, Marcus was brought to the Harrington Mansion on Union Avenue, a Greek revival house meant to awe, its 6 white columns like pillars of entitlement. Edmund Harrington, prepared for a son's folly, was instead struck dumb the moment he took in the newcomer. He circled Marcus the way Charles had, the older man's expression shifting from anger to fascination and some unease that read like a guilty conscience. "Extraordinary," Edmund murmured. "You may have actually demonstrated business sense for once, Charles." Marcus answered questions with a voice polished in drawing rooms rather than workshops. He organized Edmund's correspondence with an economy of motions that suggested not only skill, but an uncanny anticipation. Sorting letters, decoding a ledger, presenting missing invoices with a prescience that made the elder man pause. He was quartered in the East Wing, placed within earshot of Edmund's study. Such proximity elevated him above the household servants and made whispers among the staff inevitable. Housekeeper Bess, who had served the family for decades, voiced what others felt. "It ain't right," she said bluntly. "He ain't like the others. He watches everything." The rest of the servants kept a wary distance. Marcus moved among them with a calm that unsettled more than it impressed. At dinner parties, his presence produced the exact effect Charles had imagined: admiration, curiosity, faint envy. Mrs. Sarah Dalton asked plainly where he had been found. Victoria Cavendish watched with narrowed eyes, as if trying to read the watermark beneath the veneer. Yet among the polite compliments and the suppressed questions, one idea took root in Edmund's mind and would not be dismissed. Where had Fletcher truly acquired this man, and who was Mrs. Eleanor Stratton? Letters were sent to Richmond. Answers, when they came, deepened rather than resolved the mystery. No one in the city directories knew an Eleanor Stratton. Handwriting experts could not immediately disprove the signature. The social registry returned only a blank. Marcus, meanwhile, kept his past close. He read French novels in his quarters and answered inquiries with deliberate vagueness. He had been trained, he said. He had been raised in circumstances that were not ordinary for the trade. He did not protest his fate in public. Who would have believed him against documents? And even as Edmund began his discreet investigations into Marcus's provenance, a more delicate question began to haunt Charles, one that had less to do with money than with something darker. What did Marcus himself know? And how did he carry that knowledge behind those gray-green eyes? Charles's unease hardened into action. He began to listen where others listened poorly, in taverns, at the club, in the soft eavesdropping that is the city's true intelligence network. What he found returned in fragments. Rumors of Cavendish in Richmond in November, reports that the Kendishes' spending had become reckless, whispers of failed investments and secret trips. It smelled of preparation. Someone, it seemed, had been looking for Marcus before any of them had consented to purchase him. That someone arrived that January evening in the person of Jacob Dalton. He came without ceremony, his carriage rolling to the Harrington portico like a blunt instrument. Dalton, whose reputation as a broker had been built on appetite and discretion, removed all pretense the moment he crossed the threshold. He wanted Marcus. He named a price that made Edmund's breath hitch. 5,000. When Edmund refused, Dalton raised the figure to 6 and then, in a voice softened to a conspirator's hush, told them what everyone suspected, but none had admitted aloud. Richard Kendish wanted the boy stolen. The name Kendish landed like a slap. Edmund thought of Victoria's salons, of New Orleans connections, of the quiet, efficient ways the Kendishes turned favors into leverage. Dalton's insinuation was surgical. Fletcher's disappearance, Dalton said, and the odd provenance of the papers, these weren't coincidences. Fletcher trafficked in very particular commodities. He supplied collectors, private men who paid for rarity and obedience. He didn't frequent publicly advertised auctions for a reason. And Cavendish? He had means and motive. Financial ruin that could be solved by secrecy and extortion. What Dalton offered came wrapped in a warning. Cavendish had approached him, proposed theft and blackmail, offered inducements to secure Marcus for a private agenda. If Edmund refused and the man fell into Cavendish's hands, the consequences would be more than monetary. The man would be weaponized against a family in Virginia, a scandal sold piece by piece. Edmund wrestled with the proposal the way a man wrestles with an accusation whose truth he cannot deny, with a growing sense of personal culpability. The papers had seemed legitimate when Pembroke read them. Who dreams a mother of her own son would manufacture proof and sell him away? Yet Dalton's words planted a seed of dread that would not be removed. That night, Edmund confronted Marcus in private. Under the lamplight of his study, the older man asked the question that had become inevitable. "Who are you, really?" Marcus answered without theatrics. "He was born free in Virginia," he said. Fletcher's documents were not, as the buyer presumed, the whole truth. They had enabled the transaction because nobody wanted to believe the word of a man in chains over the ink on a page. Marcus's past, when he allowed himself to speak of it, was a slow, bitter revelation. Debt had undone his family. Someone had sold him. A mother's resolve to preserve a name had become her instrument for the very thing she feared. He had been taught to read, to manage households, to play an instrument. He had learned the currency of gentility because it might keep him alive. When Charles pressed him on why he hadn't protested earlier, Marcus asked a question in return that needed no answer. Who would have believed him? The law, more often than not, accepted ownership before it accepted truth. What Marcus asked of Edmund in the hush of that night was both small and enormous. Help me disappear. Not because he wanted a quiet life, but because he needed leverage, a chance to live beyond the ledger. He did not appeal to pity. He offered a bargain, money and papers for silence, a clean absence that would let the Harringtons avoid whatever trial would follow exposure. Edmund, with a father's instinct for self-preservation and a conscience that had been thinned by years of profitable transactions, listened. It was a dangerous bargain. To aid a man in vanishing would invite the wrath of men like Dalton and Kendish. Yet Edmund saw a quiet salvation in it. If Marcus left under cover and the story remained private, they might all yet avoid ruin. They struck a deal. In 3 days, Marcus would be gone, provided Edmund supplied funds, forged papers, and secrecy. If Marcus betrayed them, Edmund promised, in the old language of threats the man had long used on rivals, he would spend every resource to find him. The handshake that closed the bargain felt less like ownership and more like the admission of complicity. What followed unfolded like something both inevitable and fevered. The very next morning, a candle of misfortune was set to burn. Richard Kendish's warehouse caught fire. The blaze consumed a fortune in cotton and cargo, and the timing suggested cold calculation. It removed Cavendish from immediate action, pinning him in the hospital with burns and giving others an opportunity to move. Men whispered of insurance fraud, creditors, and the desperate theatrics of a man drowning in debt. Fewer cared to consider another possibility, that someone wanted Cavendish distracted while other plans moved forward. Within 48 hours, the city's equilibrium began to fail. Thomas Dalton, Jacob's eldest son, was found dead in his chamber, a collapse with no visible cause, a body that suggested seizure and nothing else. The death came with the same silence that accompanies scandal. No foul play was alleged publicly, but the timing was poisonous. A cotton factor who had been among those to gossip about Marcus, William Drexler, fell dead in his chair at a business lunch. 2 sudden deaths, 2 brittle silences. The city's rumor mills, always the first to feed on misfortune, spun their wheels into fever. And then Marcus vanished. It happened in sunlight and domestic quiet. Victoria Cavendish arrived at the Harrington house, vehement and raw, demanding Marcus be handed over. Edmund denied her, asserting the man was his property and warning that a legal entanglement would be perilous. Victoria's temper suggested more than social pique. She spoke of watchers and theft, of plots to take Marcus in the night for reasons that terrified her. Seconds after her departure, Charles cried out that Marcus was gone. No struggle, no sign of flight, a neatly made bed, a room emptied as if the occupant had never existed. Initial suspicion pointed to Dalton. A stable hand reported a carriage with Dalton's family colors near the back entrance at dawn. Edmund's first thought was fury. Had Dalton taken him without consent? But grief and alibis complicated the simple calculus. Dalton, reeling from Thomas's death, was not the man to plan a bold kidnapping. His energies had been devoted to mourning, not enterprise. Within days, a notorious slave catcher arrived. Silas Ketch, a man hired by the 3 families who jointly realized that private law and private interest had become entangled. He wore the look of someone who had learned to harvest other people's emergencies for profit. Ketch reported a discovery that rewired all their assumptions. He had found an old plantation house some miles outside the city, supposedly abandoned, but currently occupied by people who had been watching the 3 families for months. In its rooms, Ketch found ledgers, letters, and an obsessive dossier. Details of illegal purchases, falsified bills, evidence of bribery and compromise. Someone had cataloged everything. Every transaction that might convict them, every private whisper that would destroy a reputation. And then Ketch produced an envelope addressed to the 3 men. Edmund opened it with shaking hands. Inside lay a single page, written in a steady hand that carried indignation like a blade. The note accused them, by name, of trafficking in a freeborn man, of preferring ornamentation to conscience, of taking advantage of the vulnerable. It claimed the writer's son had been taken, and that the writer had been watching for months. It offered a menace and a mercy in equal measure. Within 30 days, each would receive instructions on how to make reparations, and if they complied, the writer would relinquish all evidence. If not, if they refused, or if they tried violence, everything would be made public. The letter closed with a name that landed like a dirge, Elena Thornton. Silence followed the reading. The room felt suddenly colder. The ledger of their lives, it seemed, was now being consulted by another hand. A litany turned against them. They had imagined themselves as holders of secrets. Someone had been keeping a ledger of their secret-keeping. Outside the study, Memphis moved on with indifferent industry. Inside, 3 men who had once measured one another with sharp-cornered ambition now measured a problem none of them had authored, but all of them had fueled. They were not merely accused, they were given terms. The page's last line stank of moral authority. Choose wisely. The 30 days that followed unfolded like a slow, tightening noose. The letters arrived one by one, delivered to each household by anonymous hands that never lingered long enough to be questioned. Each envelope contained its own meticulously tailored sentence, a set of demands crafted to pierce the exact weak point of its recipient, as if Eleanor Thornton had dissected each man's moral anatomy with surgical calm. Jacob Dalton's letter arrived first. He read it in his study just after dawn, where the lamplight was still struggling against the gray morning. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, though whether from grief or dread, even he might not have known. The demands were precise, almost legalistic. He was to write a personal confession, not merely admitting his sale of Marcus, but acknowledging that he had knowingly trafficked a freeborn man. It had to be notarized, sent to an address in Nashville within 15 days, and beyond confession, reparations. $15,000 to a fund supporting the futures of freed people. $15,000. The sum represented a violent excision of his fortune, a hollowing out of his livelihood. He sat motionless for hours, the letter lying before him like a verdict. When his wife found him at midday, Jacob's expression was hollow. His grief for Thomas mingled with a shame he had no vocabulary for. Edmund Harrington would later say, Dalton looked like a man already half gone, only waiting for the courage to finish the disappearance. Richard and Victoria Candish received their letter the following morning. The housemaid who delivered it later told neighbors that Victoria's scream echoed down the corridor, sharp as broken glass. Eleanor's demands for the Kendishes were social annihilation disguised as moral restitution. Richard was instructed to sell his remaining business interests and dedicate the full proceeds to founding a school for the children of formerly enslaved people. He was to write formal letters of apology to 3 families he had destroyed through his creative manipulations of shipping contracts. And most ruinous of all, he was to publicly withdraw from every social organization that barred membership based on race. To comply would be to obliterate his standing. To refuse was to invite exposure. Victoria smashed a crystal vase against the fireplace. "We will not bend to a woman who betrayed her own blood," she spat. But Richard, with his bandaged hands and his already battered pride, said quietly, "She didn't sell him. She lost him, and she's been hunting him ever since." Their household descended into war, Victoria calling for violence, Richard considering compliance, both too proud to agree on anything except their hatred for the woman who had named their sins aloud. At the Harrington estate, the letter arrived last. Edmund read his alone in his study. The door closed, the fire guttering low. Charles found him hours later, still sitting there, the page lax in his trembling hand. The demands were devastating. He was to free all 16 of his slaves, provide documentation, travel funds, and assistance. He was to resign from the bank boards. He was to acknowledge, if discreetly, that he had engaged in a purchase he knew was ethically compromised. Charles had never seen his father weep before. It was not the loud grief of Dalton's household. It was a silent undoing, as if Eleanor's handwriting had eroded something inside him that had been quietly weakening for years. "It's over," Edmund whispered. "Everything we built, everything we believed about our purpose, our place, it was all rot, and she's forcing us to reckon with it." But Charles, who had spent those same months wrestling with truths he did not wish to face, saw something different. Not collapse, but crossroads. He demanded that the families convene, that they gather and decide together what kind of men they would be at the world's edge. And so, under cover of night, the meeting took place. Dalton, hollow-eyed, Candish, stiff with pride, Victoria, cold and electric with wrath, Edmund quiet as a man standing at his own grave, and Charles feeling as though he stood on a shore about to be swept clean. Victoria began with the language of violence. "We find her. We kill her. This ends when she is dead and her documents are ash. It ends when we stop pretending we're innocent," Charles countered softly. Dalton murmured that compliance, though ruinous, might spare them prison. Candish snarled that ruin was worse than prison. Edmund said little, his silence itself a verdict. The alliance that had been forged briefly by fear fractured fully by the meeting's end. Each family splintered into its own desperate calculus. Each went home carrying not resolve, but the certainty that they had been weighed and measured, and that the remainder was far smaller than they had imagined. Jacob Dalton, drowning in guilt and freshly stripped of the armor of ambition, made his choice quickly. He began assembling his confession. He liquidated assets. He withdrew the money. No one knows what words he intended to send to Nashville, only that he faltered before he could send them. Because 12 days before the deadline, he ended his life. He was found at dawn by his wife, hanging from the beam above his desk, the letter from Eleanor open on the table below. A single note pinned to his chest. "I cannot live with what I have done. God forgive me." 2 days later, Candish's body was discovered in a Nashville hotel room. The official report said heart failure. Whisperers said strangulation. Victoria claimed conspiracy. Others claimed justice. The truth, as always, receded into shadows. With Dalton and Candish gone, the full weight of Eleanor's attention turned toward Edmund Harrington. He responded by doing what neither of the others could. He reached out to her, quietly, through intermediaries trained in discretion. He requested a meeting. She granted one. A small church stood empty on weekdays, and there Edmund arrived with Charles at his side, arms concealed beneath their coats, fear concealed beneath their composure. Eleanor waited for them with a posture of quiet command. At her side stood Marcus, alive, unchained, unmistakably transformed by the choices he had been forced to make. The sanctuary held the stillness of a confession booth. It felt as though the walls themselves were listening. "Mr. Harrington," Eleanor said, her voice calm, "you wished to negotiate." Edmund asked the question that had already been haunting him. Was she responsible for the deaths of Dalton and Candish? Her answer was measured. Dalton died by his own hand. Guilt consumed him. As for Richard Candish, men who consort with violent associates sometimes discover their associates have motives of their own. Then, with a surgeon's precision, she asked Edmund what he had come to offer. He pleaded not for himself, but for the innocents entangled in his downfall, his wife, his household, the employees who had no hand in his choices. "Let the consequences fall on me alone," he asked. "Not on those who trusted me." Eleanor studied him the way a judge might study a man after a long trial, listening not to the plea, but to the sincerity beneath it. Then she turned to Charles. "You argued for compliance," she said. "Was that conviction or manipulation?" Charles answered with something honest. For once. He didn't know. He only knew that what they had done to Marcus was wrong, and that recognizing humanity in a person he had been taught to think of as property had unmoored him from everything he had believed about himself. For the first time, Eleanor's eyes softened. She revised her terms. She would accept the freeing of the slaves. She would accept Edmund's resignations. But she would not require public humiliation. Not if the Harringtons complied fully and immediately. "Marcus?" Charles asked quietly. "What happens to you now?" Marcus met his gaze with a composure that no longer carried the practiced neutrality of servitude. "I'm going north," he said. "Not to hide, to become something. A lawyer, perhaps, an advocate. I will never forgive what was done to me, but I can choose what I do with the remnants." The bargain was sealed. No handshake this time, only acknowledgement. Eleanor and Marcus left Memphis that afternoon. Edmund and Charles rode home wordlessly, carrying the weight of both disaster and a strange, unexpected mercy. Over the following months, the Harrington name diminished, but did not collapse. Their slaves were freed, funds were paid, positions relinquished. Society whispered, suspecting scandal but never grasping its magnitude. Within 2 years, the Harringtons remained standing, smaller, quieter, chastened. The Daltons vanished into obscurity, the Kendishes into ruin, Marcus into fog and rumor. History only caught glimpses afterward. A man in Boston who resembled him, legal petitions in handwriting similar to his, whispers of underground railroad work. His mother died in 1859, remembered as a widow who devoted her final years to charitable causes. Memphis forgot, as cities do, once the blood was washed from the cobblestones and new scandals took its place. But for those who survived, the memory was indelible. It revealed an era in which beauty could be bartered, freedom falsified, and conscience purchased, until conscience found a voice sharp enough to cut through the machinery of power. And when that voice came, it did not whisper. It demanded reckoning. Tell us, what stays with you from this story? The power of secrets, the cost of truth, or the way a single life misjudged and mishandled unraveled an entire city's illusion of control?